If I had to give this a particular title, here's how I would title it: A Tale of Three Murders. A Tale of Three Murders. This is actually kind of a gruesome passage of Scripture. And you're thinking, why are we doing three chapters tonight? Because all three chapters are intertwined, they are connected in a real way. Now, let me just just for background purposes, just remember this. Now, David had been a fugitive for about 14 years. Think about this. After he's anointed king, he goes to serve King Saul. King Saul becomes insanely jealous, and the next thing you know, David is on the run. So for about a period of about 14 years, David had been going through a time of being a fugitive. Well, now he's about to enter into a time of not being a fugitive, but some of the most fruitful years of his life where he's going to be anointed king again. In fact, you read through the book of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, he's anointed king 3 different times. Back in chapter 16, he's anointed privately by the priest Samuel. He's going to be anointed here again in chapter 2 as king over Judah. And then next week, when we look at chapter 5, he's going to be anointed king as he becomes king over all of Israel. Okay? But now, I want you to look at chapter 3 and verse 1, because if you were going to summarize these 3 chapters, I think chapter 3, verse 1 would be the summary verse, or the key verse that kind of captures of what the subject matter is in these 3 chapters. Here's what it says. It says, "And now there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David." But then notice this next statement made in chapter 3, verse 1. It says, "But David grew stronger and stronger." But what was going on with the house of Saul? It grew weaker and weaker. So, as you can imagine, Saul and at least 3 of his sons are dead. He had certainly more sons than that. We're going to be introduced to one tonight. His kingdom had already been ripped away by God. God has already said, you know what, your lineage will not continue to serve in the line of the kings, right? David is going to be that king, and God's made a incredible promise to David in the Davidic covenant, right? And so what ends up happening is you've got the family of Saul basically hanging on for dear life. And Saul's guy by the name of Abner, that we're going to kind of be reintroduced to tonight, who is going to defend the kingdom of Saul as long as he can. And so that's going to create some problems for David moving forward, okay? And so David is now getting stronger and stronger. His following is getting stronger and stronger. And as a result, the house of Saul is getting weaker and weaker, mainly because so many of them are dying off, okay? But we come to these 3 chapters. I mentioned to you that they are 3 gruesome chapters because each chapter contains a murder. There's a murder that takes place in chapter 2. There's a murder that takes place in chapter 3. And there's a murder that takes place in chapter 4. And they are all 3 interconnected. So that raises a question, though, and that is this. I put this in your notes, right, by means of introduction. Why does the Bible, I want you to just kind of think out loud with me just for a little bit. Why does the Bible record these types of events? This is not isolated. We see other places where someone is killed or they die, or the way they die. You know, I think about, you read through the book of Judges and how some of those individuals died. You know, I think about Ahab, and how he died. I think about, we think about how Saul died and what they did with the body. You remember that from a few weeks ago. And so why does the Bible include these gruesome events? Why does the Bible even record these particular events? I think there are 2 primary reasons, and I want you to write these down, okay? Number 1, you need to remember this. See if you agree with this statement. The Bible is a real book about real life. Did you get that? The Bible is a real book about real life. And so what we are reading tonight are actually historical events, right? And the Bible is recording those for us. And so what you're going to see tonight, we're going to learn what not to do, and we're also going to learn what to do, right? And so it's important to remember that the Bible is not a book that is made up of fairy tales. The Bible gives us, I mean, think about the life of David, a man after God's own heart. Do we ever see any of his warts? We ever see any of his hang-ups? We think about Moses, we think about Abraham being a friend of God. Was Abraham perfect? We start looking at these Bible characters and thinking, oh man, I can never be these things. But guess what? They were very much like you and I. And I'm grateful that the Bible lets us see not just the positive things that we see in their lives, those things that we ought to aspire to be, but we also see some of their warts, their hiccups, if you will. Hey, I don't want to do that. We see the consequences of that, right? Smart people learn from the bad things in other people's life, right? We don't want to repeat those kind of things. So number one, the Bible is a real book about real life. I hope you agree with that, because I certainly believe that is true, right? Remember, the Bible is a book of history, and it's a book of not just history, but it's a book of true history. It's actually recording exactly what transpired. So God faithfully records in his word what transpired. Number two, I'm going to see if you can fill in this blank. Okay? The second reason is this: in spite of human sin and failure, God is still able to accomplish his very close purposes. Purposes, plans, all the same thing, right? So think about this. No matter what happens, nothing can thwart the plan and purpose of God. Even though man attempts to get in the way of God's plan and purpose, ultimately all fail, and God's will be done. Does that encourage you to the kind of God that we serve? That God's will and purpose is always done, no matter how much man tries to butcher it, or maybe intentionally or unintentionally. No matter how badly we mess up, God's plan is going to be carried out. All right. Well, let's look at chapter 2, and then chapter 3 and chapter 4. Chapter 4 is a shorter chapter. Chapters 2 and 3 a little bit longer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through these verses, but we're not going to spend a great deal of time digging deep into these verses, but I do want to hit the highlights of these. And so, murder number 1, we find the murder of a brother. The murder of a brother. And we'll learn his name in just a few short moments. But let's look at the positive here. In verses 1 through 4, chapter 2, verses 1 through 4 says this: and it happened after that, okay, David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up to any of the cities of Judah? Okay, now keep in mind, the nation of Israel has been divided. You've got David's followers, and you've got the followers of those of Saul. And the kingdom that Saul had been ruling and reigning over is known as Israel. And David is ruling over a small group, a small band, if you will, of basically about 1,000 people called Judah, right? And so here's what David does. Here's one of the things that, by the way, this is something that you and I ought to do. When you and I are faced with a task or to make a decision, what does David do? David inquires of the Lord. He seeks wisdom from God, right? God, what is it that you want me to do? Had God said no, would he have gone? No. I don't think so. But he asked God, hey, in verse 1, and it happened after this that David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up to any of the cities of Judah? And does God delay an answer? No, God gives him a ready answer, does he not? In the middle part of verse 1, it's the Lord said to him, go up. And so David, all right, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. Where do you want me to go up? And God even tells him that, to go to Hebron. Now, let me just say this. You may even hear about Hebron in the news these days. I'll tell you this. Compared to the biblical days, Hebron was not nearly as dangerous as it is today. Now, what's the significance of Hebron? Hebron is where some of God's choicest people are buried. You think about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their wives are buried in the cave Machpelah there. But today, did you know upon that cave there is a mosque for Muslims there? And so they don't really let tourists go there anymore because it's a very dangerous place. But David is told to go up there. Wasn't this severe back when David was there? So pick up in verse 2. He's told to go there. Look what happens. So David went up there, and his two wives also, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess and Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. Let me just stop right here. I'm talking about the warts of Bible characters. You do understand tonight that God's divine plan for husbands and wives has always been one man for one woman for one lifetime. But David has multiple wives. We know that he's listed 2 here, but he actually has 3. Y'all remember Michal, we're going to find about her tonight too. I remember after David had fled from Saul gave David's wife, his daughter, to another man to be a wife, right? And so even though David was a man after his own heart, he's not very wise when it comes to picking wives, and has a bunch of kids with them. In fact, verse 4 says, then the men of Judah came, and there were anointed David. This is the second time, by the way, that he's anointed king. Remember the first time over there in 1 Samuel 16. He'll be anointed again next week when we look at chapter 5. Then the men of Judah came, and they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And they told David, saying, the men of Jabesh Gilead were the ones who buried Saul. Now, y'all remember them from chapter 31. Remember that? Who took their own lives into their own hands, went into Philistine territory and recovered at least the bodies of Saul and his 3 sons, right? To show respect, right? And so David is going to reach out to these men. He says, you are blessed, this is verse 5, you are blessed to the Lord, for you have shown this kindness to your Lord, to Saul, and have buried him. Now may the Lord show kindness and truth to you. I also will repay you with kindness because you have done this thing. Now, therefore, let your hands be strengthened, be valiant, for your master Saul is dead. Also, the house of Judah has anointed me king over them. You think, well, I thought you said that this chapter was about a murder of a brother. Well, we're getting to it, okay? Verse 8 through 11 is interesting because, again, Saul's family and Saul's leadership is not going to give up the fight. In fact, this guy named Abner, who many believe to be the uncle of Saul, right? But he was also the commander of Saul's army, okay? He's certainly going to try to put up a fight and to put up resistance to anyone else becoming king. And so here's what he does in verse 8. But Abner, the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, now watch this, took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, this is another son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. Verse 9, and what did he do with him? He made him king over Gilead, over the Asherites, over Jezreel, over Ephraim. Now watch this, over Benjamin, and over what? Over all Israel. Now, I'm going to tell you something. If there was ever a man who was not qualified to be king, it's Ishbosheth. In fact, does anybody know what his name means? It means shame. Okay, he was kind of a milquetoast kind of guy. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. Only the house of Judah followed David. So you've got a split kingdom here. Verse 11, and the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. We know that David would eventually reign 40 years total, right? As all 3 kings. You had Saul for 40 years, you had David for 40 years, you had Solomon for 40 years. Now, here we find the murder of a brother in verse 12 and following. Now again, Abner, who is he? He's the commander of Saul's army, right? So look what happens here. Now Abner, the son of Ner, and the servants of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon. Now this gets bizarre to me. This is just, you want to talk about an attitude that's almost adopted the way we are here in America and the world today. We're going to read this just a moment. You're going to have Saul's side, Abner and his group, okay? And you're going to have Joab, who's now David's commander-in-chief, if you will, as far as the army goes. And they're going to basically say, hey, I'm going to put my 12 men up, and you're going to put your 12 men up, and we're just going to watch them fight. Watch what happens here. And Joab said to Zeruiah, just by the way, you might just say this, Joab, the son of Zeruiah. You might underscore Zeruiah there. This is David's half-sister, okay? And the servants of David, okay? So Joab is David's nephew, but he's also David's commander of his army, right? And so he is the son of Zeruiah, one of David's half-sister. And he went out and he met by the pool of Gibeon. And watch what they do. And they sat down, one on one side of the pool and the other on the other side of the pool. Then Abner said to Joab, let the young men now arise and compete before us. And Joab said, hey, sounds like a good idea. Let them rise. So they arose and went over by numbers. We're told how many there are. There's 12 from Benjamin. That is 12 from Saul's group, right? The followers of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul. And then there's 12 from the servants of David. So get this picture. You've got this body of water. On one side, you've got Joab. On the other side, you've got Abner. And each one sends 12 men into this little mini war, if you will. Verse 16 says, and each one grasped his opponent by the head and thrust his sword into his opponent's side. Now watch this. So they fell down together. How many died? All 24 of them. Can you imagine that?
That's silly.
Can't you just see it? I try not to visualize this, but I do. They've got each other by the head. They've each drawn back their swords. And simultaneously, they stab each other through. And what you have is not anybody winning. You have everybody dying.
That's lovely.
What'd you say? That's a good point. Didn't prove anything, but you know what? I'd say if it proved anything, it would prove this. They did not value life, just like we don't today. I mean, people, think about this. People will murder over a pair of shoes. Murder over stuff. Just like that we have become here in America, we have become bloodthirsty. I mean, think about this. 12 young men whose lives were all in front of them. For what purpose? No purpose. Doesn't serve a purpose at all.
The only thing it did was keep Joab and Abner from fighting.
Yet.
Yeah.
Now, lock in on verse 17. It says, so there was a very fierce battle that day, and Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. Now, lock in on verse 13, because there's three names I want you to underscore, if you don't mind writing in your Bible. It says, and the three sons of Zeruiah, remember, she's the half-sister of David. We have already met Joab, right? So underscore Joab. And then there's Abishai, okay, that's son number 2. And there's a son by the name of Asahel. So you've got these three brothers, right? Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Now, we're told something about Asahel. What kind of... He could run fast. In fact, we're told that he was as fleet of foot as a wild gazelle. If he had entered the NFL draft, maybe he was a prospect for the Cowboys. He was fast. And because he was fast, look at verse 19. The Bible tells us that Asahel pursued Abner. Now, is Abner a friend or foe? He's foe, right? Asahel pursued Abner. Now, keep in mind, we've already been told how old. We've been told that obviously Abner's been around a long time, right? So he's not going to be nearly as fleet of foot. And so now he's got this young cat who runs really, really fast. And we're told that Asahel is in full pursuit after Abner. And I guarantee you, he's not chasing him to give him an invitation to a party.
No, he got a sword.
But notice what it says. And Asahel pursued Abner, and he's going, and he did not turn to the right hand or to the left from following Abner. But here, they're talking to each other. This is pretty funny. Verse 20, then Abner looked behind him and said, are you Asahel? And he said, yes, I am. Verse 21, and Abner said to him, look, he gives him a warning. He gives him a warning. He says, turn aside to your right hand or to your left and lay hold of one of the young men and take his armor for yourself. But what did Asahel, how did he respond to that? He would not turn aside from following him. So Abner said again to Asahel, turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How then should I face your brother? In other words, I don't want to get your big brother involved. No. Verse 23, however, he refused to turn aside. Therefore, Abner struck him in the stomach with the blunt end of the spear so that the spear came out of his back. And he fell down there and what? Died on the spot. So it was that as many as came to the place where Asahel fell down and died stood still. But here's the thing. Joab, his brother, doesn't know that his little brother has died just yet at the hands of Abner. So look what happens in verse 24. And Joab and Abishai also pursued Abner. The sun was going down when they came to the hill of Ammah, which is by Giah, by the road of the wilderness of Gibeon. Now the children of Benjamin gathered together behind Abner and became a unit and took their stand on top of a hill. Then Abner called to Joab. Okay, Joab is part of David's army. Abner is part of Saul's army. He calls out to him and he says, shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know that it will be bitter in the latter end? How long will it be until you tell the people to return from pursuing their brethren? And Joab said, as God lives, unless you had spoken, surely then by morning all the people would have given up pursuing their brethren. So what does Joab do? He blows a trumpet, and the people stood still and did not pursue Israel anymore, nor did they fight anymore. All's good. That ends well, right? Then Abner and his men went on all that night through the plain, crossed over the Jordan, and went through all Bithron, and they came to Methanaim. And Joab returned from pursuing Abner, and when they had gathered all the people together, they were missing David's servants, 19 men. Asahel. And who's Asahel? He is Joab's brother. So let's do the numbering here. Let's do the count here. Do our math. How many men from David's army died? 19 plus 1 equals 20. Look at verse 31. But the servants of David had struck down, of Benjamin and Abner's men, 360 men who died. So I think it's safe to say that there was a major advantage for David's men. But then they took Asahel and buried him in his father's tomb, which was in Bethlehem. And Joab and his men went all night, and they came to Hebron at daybreak. Now, how do you think Joab's going to react to the fact that his brother has been murdered? Now, some of us would probably argue that this was self-defense. It wasn't like he wasn't warned. But the fact of the matter is he took a life that he should not have taken. Right? And so we see... Probably would have. Yeah, that's what he was going for. Again, he wasn't taking him a Christmas card. Yeah, he intended harm for Abner.
So he, in a sense, was just defending himself.
Right.
That's what I think.
Right.
When you have intent to kill it.
I mean, we would probably have done the same thing, right?
Yeah, right.
Hey, if it's a matter of your life versus mine, I guess it's going to have to be yours. Well, that's going to lead to the death of a commander in chapter 3. And you can probably figure out who that person is. Abner. Because Joab is going to avenge the death of his brother. But before we get to that, I want you to see what David does. David does an incredible thing because think about what Joab has done. If David's goal was to be king over all Israel, and now Joab is going to take matters in his own hand and kill Abner. Abner is a well-respected man in Israel, okay, do you think there's even a remote chance that the people of Israel are going to come to the belief that David ordered the hit on Abner?
Very possible.
I think absolutely so. And so how's David going to overcome this? And I think he's going to go, and in fact, just pick up the story here. I don't want to get too far ahead. Let's pick up in verse 2. It says, and sons were born to David in Hebron. The firstborn was Ammon by Ahinoam the Jezreelitess. His children, Chileab by Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. Third, Absalom, the son of Micah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. The fourth, Adonai, the son of Haggith. The fifth, Shabbatiah of Abital. The sixth, Ithream by David's wife Eglah. These were born to David while he were in Hebron. In fact, David's going to end up having at least 20 sons and one daughter. We know that he had at least one daughter. Let me say this about David. Think about, is there something that we ought to, I guess, we think about David's life. David was a very good king in the grand scheme of things. In fact, Israel would say that he was their greatest king of all of their kings. But I'll tell you this about David. He may have been a great king, but he was a sorry dad. He was a terrible, terrible parent. And I think part of it might have been that, number one, he messed up by having these many different wives. And through those many wives, having all of these children, I'm sure, who had some rivalry amongst themselves. It's bad enough that when they all come from the same two parents. I know that. I think about your son and daughter. Did they get along growing up? Pretty good. Pretty good. Okay, my three never got along at any stage. Okay, fair enough. They just avoided one another. Well, my three, Rita says that our three were just perfect when they were little. I'm thinking, I don't remember that. But I know by the time they got to be teenagers, it was an unholy war in the coffee house. It got to be the point where they would fight who was riding in the front seat. We would have to take two cars to church just so that we didn't have anybody bloodied on the way to church, right? Because, hey, he touched me. No, she looked at me. They said that. I'm thinking, I'll tell you what, you go with me and you two go with your mom, right? Something like that. And so it's just really, really difficult. And so David is not a good dad at all. If there's an example of how not to parent, David is that guy, right? So he has a bunch of, but watch what happens here. Something unusual happened here. Now remember, Abner had wanted this other son of Saul to become king. In fact, basically handpicks him to be the king. But now he's going to have a falling out with Ishbosheth. Verse 6. Now it is so, while there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David, that Abner was strengthening his hold on the house of Saul. And Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah. So Ishbosheth said to Abner, why have you gone in to my father's concubine? Then Abner became very angry at the words of Ishbosheth and said, am I a dog's head that belongs to Judah? Today I show loyalty to the house of Saul your father, to his brothers and to his friends, and have not delivered you into the hand of David, and you charge me today with a fault concerning this woman? May God do so to Abner, and more so, if I do not do for David as the Lord has sworn to him. Do you see a changing of the attitude here? No longer is he going to be supporting the household of Saul. He's about to defect. Watch this. He says, and to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and set up the throne of David over Israel, over Judah, from Dan to Beersheba. And he could not answer Abner another word because he feared him. That is, Ishbosheth feared Abner because he knew what Abner was capable of doing. Then Abner sent messengers on his behalf to David, saying, whose is the land? Saying also, make your covenant with me. So Abner sends messengers ahead of David and said, look, I want to come join your forces. I want to come join forces with you. And he asked this question. He said, make your covenant with me, and indeed my hand shall be with you to bring all Israel to you. So what he's telling David is, look, if you'll allow me to defect to you, I can pretty much deliver the kingdom of Israel over to you. Now, this is something that David wants. Now think about what David's doing here in allowing Abner to do this. Who do you think was the spearhead that led the revolt of Saul to David? I mean, think about this. For 14 years, Abner was just as intent on having David's head on a wall as Saul was. But now he comes and he wants to join forces. Look at verse 13. And David said, good, I will make a covenant with you, but the one thing I'll require, David said, okay, I'll make a deal with you. I'll let you join forces with me, but you've got to do something for me. What is that? You shall not see my face unless you first bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when you come to see my face. Who's that? That's his first wife. Yeah. So David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, saying, give me my wife Michal, whom I have betrothed to myself, for 100 foreskins of the Philistines. And Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband, from Paltiel, the son of Laish. Then her husband went along with her to Bahurim, weeping behind her. So Abner said to him, go, return, and he returned. Now Abner had communicated with the elders of Israel, saying, in time past you were seeking for David to be king over you. Now then, do it, for the Lord has spoken to David, saying, by the hand of my servant David, I will save my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and the hand of all their enemies. And Abner also spoke in the hearing of Benjamin. Then Abner also went to speak in the hearing of David in Hebron, all that seemed good to Israel and the whole house of Benjamin. So Abner and 20 men with him came to David in Hebron, and David made a feast for Abner and the men who were with him. Then Abner said to David, I will arise and go and gather all Israel to my lord the king, that they may make a covenant with you, that you may reign over all that your heart desires. So David sent Abner away and went in peace. Now we're not there yet, but we're about to read this. Do you see the problem? Joab is now well aware that his brother's dead, and he's also aware why his brother is dead. Abner killed him. But now Abner wants to come and be a part of David's kingdom. How do you think Joab is going to react to that? Not good. Look what happens. He confronts David in verse 22. At that moment, the servants of David and Joab came from a raid and brought much spoil with them. But Abner was not with David in Hebron. That was probably a good thing. Gave him a little bit more time. For he had sent him away, and he had gone in peace. When Joab and all the troops that were with him had come, they told Joab, saying, listen, Abner the son of Ner came to the king, and he sent him away, and he's gone in peace. Then Joab came to the king, that is King David, and said, what have you done? Look, Abner came to you. Why is it that you have sent him away? And not only that, he's already gone. Surely you realize, he's now planting this seed in David's head, you realize he's not coming to help you. He's coming to be a hindrance to you. Surely you realize that Abner, the son of Ner, came to deceive you, to know you're going out and you're coming in, to know all that you are doing. And Joab had gone from David's presence. He sent messengers after Abner. Now watch what he does. You're talking about lowball. I mean, a low thing to do. He sent messengers after Abner, who brought him back to the wall of Sirah, but David did not know it. So David is unaware of the actions of what Joab is doing. Verse 27, then Abner had returned into Hebron, and Joab took him aside in the gate to speak with him privately, and there stabbed him in the stomach, so that he died for the blood of Asahel, his brother. Afterward, when David heard it, he said, my kingdom and I are guiltless before the Lord forever for the blood of Abner the son of Ner. Let it rest on the head of Joab, on all his father's house, and let there never fail to be in the house of Joab one who has a discharge or is a leper, who leans on a staff or falls on the sword or lacks the bread. So Joab and Abishai, his brother, killed Abner because he had killed their brother Asahel at Gibeon in battle. So David's got a massive problem on his hands. But what does he do? Here's one of the things. Here's one of the positive things that David does. Because look what he does in verses 31 through 39. Then David said to Joab and to all the people who were with him, "Tear your clothes, gird yourselves with sackcloth, and what? Mourn for Abner." And King David followed the coffin. And they buried Abner in Hebron, and the king lifted up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner, and all the people wept. Now think about what David's doing here. David's doing a couple of things here. Number one, he's showing great leadership. He's proving that he had nothing to do with the death of Abner. Now keep in mind, if you were David, would you kind of want Abner dead? From the fleshly standpoint, right? But that's not what David does. David is not that eye for an eye or tooth for a tooth stage, right? And so he's showing great leadership here and wanted to prove to the people he had nothing to do with Abner's death. Verse 33, look what David says. David says some interesting things here. Verse 32, it says, "And so they buried Abner in Hebron, and the king lifted up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner, and all the people wept. And the king sang a lament over Abner and said, 'Should Abner die as a fool dies? Your hands were not bound, nor were your feet put into feathers. As a man falls before the wicked men, so you tell.' Then all the people wept over him again." Verse 35, "And when all the people came to persuade David to eat food, while it was still day, David took an oath, saying, God do so to me, and more so if I taste bread or anything else till the sun goes down." Now here's the kicker. Put a star by verse 36. "Now all the people took note of it, and what did it do? It pleased them, since whatever the king did pleased all the people." You realize how impossible that is? We often say you can please some of the people all the time, and all the people some of the time, but you can never please all the people all the time. David has accomplished what many could never accomplish. Verse 37, "For all the people and all Israel understood that day." Why did he do what he's doing? "For all the people understood that day," all Israel understood, rather, "that it had not been the king's intent to kill Abner, the son of Ner." In fact, look what he says in verse 38. "Then the king said to his servants, 'Do you not know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel?' And he says, 'And I am weak today, though anointed king, and these men, the sons of Zeruiah, are too harsh for me, and the Lord shall repay the evildoer according to his wickedness.'" Even David had some renegades that he had to deal with. Kind of remind me of Jesus and the 12 disciples. Did Jesus have any renegades among those 12? You know, you think about Paul. I mean, not Paul, but Peter. Did he ever take matters in his own hands? Remember that after they came to arrest Jesus, what did he do? Cut the guy's ear off, and Jesus said, "Put away your sword." Jesus healed that injury that guy had. I think not only about Peter, but I think about James and John. Does anybody remember what they were called? The sons of thunder. And that was not a positive attribute or characteristic that they had. That means that they could be just as much troublemakers as well. Jesus had to deal with that. And by the way, do we have people who take matters in their own hands in the church? Let me just take a step back, and I don't want you throwing rotten tomatoes at me. I'm not thinking about anybody in particular. I'm just talking about the church in general. I'm not even talking about here. I'm just talking about the church in general. People taking matters in their own hands and doing things out of order, okay, outside the unity of the church and causing problems. But I love the leadership of David and how he deals with it. So we see the murder, number one, the murder of a brother. Number two, we see the murder of a commander. Abner comes to try to make allegiance with David. Joab takes matters in his own hands to avenge the loss of his brother, and he's created more problems. But guess what? David handles it like a champ. And then when you come to chapter 4, just real quickly, I'm out of time. Try to make this really quick. Look at verse 1. It says, and Saul's son heard that Abner had died in Hebron. Now Saul's son being Ishbosheth, right? That he lost heart and all Israel was troubled. Now his number one ally is dead. Now Saul's son had two men who were captains of troops. Okay, these guys I think are going to take matters in their own hands as well, thinking, you know what, we're probably going to be doomed anyway, so let's just go ahead and do this. In fact, let's just skip down. You talk about these two guys, a guy by the name of Benah, who's and the name of the other was Rechab. You see that? These were the sons of Rimmon and Beerothite, the children of Benjamin. For Beeroth also was a part of Benjamin. Skip down to verse 4. Jonathan's son Saul Saul's son had a son who was lame in his feet. Okay, we know him to be Mephibosheth, right? We know the story there. After David had become anointed king, Saul had died. The maid, if you will, who was taking care of Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, had heard that, hey, David's probably coming, and she picks him up, begins to run. The boy falls. He does some kind of injury to his legs to where he's crippled. So he was never going to be a candidate to be the next king over Israel. Now go down to verse 5. Then the sons of Rimmon and Beerothite, Rechab and Benah, set out and came about at the heat of the day in the house of Ishbosheth. Now, who's Ishbosheth? He's Saul's son, who's currently reigning as king over Israel. And he's lying on his bed at noontime. And they came there all the way into the house as though to get wheat. And what did they do? They stabbed him in the stomach. Do you think he's going to survive that? No. And Rechab and Benah, his brother, escaped. Verse 7, notice what they continue to do. You're talking about, again, gruesome. For when they came into the house, he was lying on his bed in the bedroom. Then they struck him and killed him, and they beheaded him and took his head. We're all night escaping through the plain. Now, why would they do that? Because they're going to do that. They're going to take the head of Ishbosheth, and they're going to take it to David and say, look, the last thing standing between you and being king over Israel has been remedied. It is in our hands. Now, knowing what we know about David, how's David going to react to this?
Not well.
What happened to the guy in chapter 1 who says that he killed Saul? David put him to death. What he thought was going to be a reward became an execution. What these guys thought would be a reward is going to become an execution. And that's what you read as you get to the end of chapter 4. Again, man, gruesome, bloody, just murder here, murder there, here a murder, there a murder. Murders everywhere. Why does the Bible reclude those? Again, the Bible is a real book about real life. But in spite of the failures of man, God's will, God's purposes are always accomplished. And you can take that to the bank. Questions? Oh, I'm calling him the usurper. U-S-U-R-P-E-R. U-S-U-R-P-E-R. You say, why are you calling him the usurper? Because, think about this. Ishbosheth should never have been king anyway. And that's what a usurper means, someone who wrongfully takes the place of another. Right? So we see the murder of a usurper. Questions or comments? It'll get a little bit cleaner next week when we look at David being anointed king over all Israel. Real quick, let me give you some updates.